tell you how excited I am that we were able to have Mark here with us tonight. He travels so much, and in fact, on our normal tomorrow night meeting, he has a 6-month engagement to be in Colorado speaking tomorrow night. So he and Patty are leaving, and I guess you leave early in the morning, right? It's the only way you can make it to Colorado in time. So we are so blessed to have someone who was the original co-founder of the Tea Party and now is president of Citizens for Self-Governance, which is another way that we are trying very hard to put up good candidates for office so that someday we can sit back and know that our government's doing the right thing. So Mark's going to tell you all about the IRS problems and some of the other problems he sees, but he's always so up that you'll feel better, I guarantee you, when he's through. Mark?
Okay, we're good. So, you know what? Where I was supposed to be tonight, actually, was John Stossel's show. So we got a call from Stossel. We had already had this on the calendar. We got a call from Stossel last week asking us to come down and tonight, be there tonight, and discuss the IRS situation. But I just want you to know, we've got our priorities straight. We're here in I'll go to Nevada County any day over New York City. You know, and I also want you guys to know, we travel around the country. I get this rare privilege to travel around, meet with Tea Partiers, go to New York, do all the television stuff and all the interviews. But you know, you come home here, and when you're at home, that's where you maintain your humility, right? So tonight, when I'm getting ready to come up here, and I'm standing here, I'm talking with Patty right before I come up, it's really important, if you ever do public speaking, there are certain things you have to check right before you go on stage. And sometimes I forget to check those things. And so it's good to have my wife with me, because I'm standing right here talking to Patty and my mom right before I come up here, and she goes, "Your fly is down." It makes me really nervous that I travel around the country and sometimes I don't have her with me. You see why? I will always need her with me, no matter what. So, you know, crazy things going on all over the country. These wild conspiracy theories that we've been circulating among ourselves for all these years have turned out to be more than just theories, right? So it's only a conspiracy theory until it's proven to be true, at which point it's just a fact. And these are facts that you and I and so many of our fellow citizens around this country, we knew that we were being targeted by the government. We knew that people who thought like us were being targeted. I've been hearing it all over the country for years. I knew it from my time with Tea Party Patriots. It took so ridiculously long for the organization to get any response from the IRS on those applications. We knew something was going on. We had no way to prove it. You know, one little Tea Party organization, you can't prove those things. Bottom line is, the reason we have this going on is that the country is out of control. The government is out of control, right? It's not just the IRS. The IRS is just a symptom. It's just one arm, one department of the federal government, but the whole federal government has spiraled out of control. It's grown too big, too aggressive. If you look at the history of the country, you can tell it's sort of like a fable of ancient times. And I look at it, and this is like the story of the great dragon. You know, we've got this huge dragon preying upon the country, upon citizens all across the countryside called big government. And originally, hundreds of years ago, when this country was formed, there was a dragon, but the dragon was called limited government. And that dragon was caged by wise people known as the framers in a cage made only of parchment called the Constitution. But it was an incredibly strong cage because it had the people behind it, and the people who drafted the Constitution and the people who argued about it and voted to ratify the Constitution knew that if the people paid attention, if the people studied that cage called the Constitution, if they followed it, if they cared for it, and if they supported it, then it would always be strong enough to hold the dragon called limited government. And they knew back then it was a dragon. I mean, there was no doubt in their minds that government needed to be restrained, that left unrestrained to roam the countryside and prey upon the people, that dragon of limited government would always become a giant government. It would become big government, preying upon the people that it was designed to serve. And so they created this incredible parchment cage, the greatest cage ever created in humanity to restrain government. And they counted not on the cage. They were wise enough to know that the cage itself could not restrain the people, that only could not restrain the dragon, that only the people they paid attention and cared for that cage and guarded that cage could restrain the dragon. And unfortunately, over a couple of centuries of prosperity and relative harmony, people stopped paying attention to that cage. And they stopped studying it, they stopped caring for the cage, and they stopped paying attention to the fact that there even was a cage that was supposed to restrain the dragon. And the dragon broke free from its cage. And that happened a long time ago. And really, we can argue that it first broke free from its cage over 100 years ago, this little dragon of limited government. And it broke free and it started to roam through society, and it was relatively unnoticed. And it went by names like the New Deal, or the Great Society, or social security, or today, climate change, right, or social justice. And it roamed through the country, and it insinuated itself into every nook and cranny of our lives, right, into our educational system. It separated us from our religion, separated government and religion completely. Right? It got involved in literally every aspect of our lives, and mostly people didn't notice. And those who did notice, and those who paid attention, and those who cried out about it were really mostly voices crying in the wilderness. And they were called crazy conspiracy theorists. That's probably the nicest thing to call, right? Wackos, wingnuts. These are the people that were pointing out that the dragon is out of the cage, right? The Constitution has been broken. And these people were vilified for the things that they were saying. And luckily, they kept crying out. They couldn't be silenced. And over time, and especially over the last 4 years, more and more people have joined those voices crying in the wilderness. The Tea Party movement was born over 4 years ago, and a lot of people stood up and heard those voices and joined that chorus crying that the dragon is out of the cage, and it is trampling the country. And it is going across the country. What it does is it drinks the sweet nectar of liberty. That nectar belongs only to us, we the people. It does not belong to the government dragon. It belongs only to us. And the more of that sweet nectar of liberty that the dragon consumes, the smaller and weaker the people have become. The dragon grows, the big government grows, the bigger the government, the smaller and weaker the citizen. And so we find ourselves today at this incredibly difficult point in our country's history where the dragon has become almost omnipotent. It's all-powerful. It does what it wants. It doesn't care if you know it's there anymore. It does things like tramples on the rights of citizens, right? Working under the auspices of the Constitution and then taking the Fifth Amendment, right? Supporting the parts of the Constitution that support the dragon and trashing those that would restrain the dragon. And that's where we find ourselves today. It's a dangerous place. I wish I could tell you that I knew where this story came out, how it ends. I don't know. I think only God himself knows where the story ends. But I do know that what we're facing right now in this country is no less a story than I'm telling you. It's an epic battle that's gone on for all of human history between good and evil. What we're seeing in this country today is evil. I mean, we should call it what it is. This is not a fight between small government people and big government people. This is not a fight between liberals and conservatives or Republicans and Democrats. This is literally a fight between good and evil. It's a fight between liberty and tyranny. That's what we're facing in this country today. And I'm pleased because I see people coming out still to meetings like this. Right? 4 years, 4.5 years into this battle that started with the launch of the Tea Party movement, people are still coming out, new people coming to meetings, right? And not just the Tea Party movement, other groups, 9/12 groups, religious liberties groups, pro-Israel groups, all groups targeted, pro-Constitution groups targeted by the IRS for a stand against government. Is anybody in here surprised that government has gotten out of control? I don't think any of us are surprised. I think probably a lot of us, I would count myself among them, weren't paying close attention for most of our lives. I wasn't paying attention. I was earning a living, raising a family, doing what we're supposed to do as American citizens, voting, but not much more than that as far as paying attention. But there is no surprise with what's happening. This is the nature of big government. This is what the founders told us would happen with big government. They were very wise. They knew what would happen. And if we had paid attention, we could have known as well. It's not a mystery, right? People are pointing to this IRS scandal, and they point it out as if it's some surprise. It's a bug in the system. Can you believe that there were rogue employees that would do something like that? First of all, rogue federal employees. Isn't that an oxymoron? Like a federal employee goes to work and they think every day, what am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? I'm just going to do the minimum. The idea that a few employees in the Cincinnati office got together around the coffee table and decided, well, it'd be really fun if we just change the rules of the IRS and do something on our own. That's really creative and unusual. It's ridiculous. But this is the system. This is the way the system works now. I've been given the privilege of writing a column for Scott Rasmussen. Rasmussen reports every week. And today I submitted another column, I think it'll be out tomorrow, talking about the idea that this is the nature of the federal government. We're not seeing an aberration. We're not seeing a surprise. We're not seeing some freak occurrence in our history. We're seeing the natural evolution of big government. And we're seeing it based on just the nature of man, right? So one of the most basic survival instincts of all species, including man, is survival, right? That's our instinct. We all want to survive. We all want to make sure that we provide for ourselves, we can provide shelter and food for our families. That's a basic instinct. And so if you are today a federal government employee, frankly, almost any government employee, but specifically a federal government employee, you would like to keep your job, wouldn't you? I mean, most of us want to keep our jobs. And what does the Tea Party say, or people who are related to the liberty movement say about the federal government? Is it too small? Too big? So we don't necessarily think about it in these human terms, but what does that mean in human terms? What do we want to see happen? We want to see the federal government shrink, don't we? Yeah. Substantially. And what will happen to those jobs when the federal government shrinks? Gone, right? So a lot of people will lose their jobs. There's a human cost to that, and I don't want to minimize that cost. People, if we get our way, people will lose their jobs. Families will go through difficult times. There will be hard times for people in the federal government when the government is downsized. You know, my dream to go back to the original departments of the federal government, you're going to see literally hundreds of thousands of federal employees lose their jobs, right? So we can cheer for that in a conceptual basis, but we need to understand the human reality is those are human beings with families and retirement plans and vacation plans and college plans and health issues and all those people have consequences when this happens. And I'm not telling you that because I'm hoping that you feel sorry for them. I'm telling you that so you understand the dynamics at play here. If you're an IRS employee and you're sitting in your office and your job is to review applications for nonprofit status, and you get an application that crosses your desk and it's from a group that you know darn well would like to see your job eliminated, you gonna go easy on that? No. If you're in any department in the United States government, what if you work at the EPA and you're getting a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, from a conservative group that would like to see the EPA done away with? Are you likely to be real cooperative with that FOIA request? No, I mean, we all want to say, in principle, you should be, right? Everybody should be treated equally. You're a government employee. That's the way it should work. We understand that. But the reality is these are human beings in these positions. So I want you to think about that. The federal government is made up of a web of people that would like to keep their jobs as much as those of you who are employed today would like to keep your jobs. And they know that we would like to see a lot of them lose their jobs. So this is a natural fight that is going to go on in any country with a big government between people who would like to see a smaller government and those who would like to keep their jobs. So when we think about the people, maybe the department heads or whatever, who will never lose their jobs, we tend not to think about the lower level employees who are just working. Right? They're just going to work every day doing their job. So this is a natural fight that's going to take place, and it's taken place always in this country, and it will continue to take place. It's just the natural state of things, right? The survival instinct versus those of us who are having to pay for all of them to keep their jobs. So when we talk about in this IRS scandal, there's a lot of focus right now on how high did these orders go, right? Does it come from counsel to the White House? Does it come from somebody in the president's inner circle? Does it come from the president himself? Is it limited to Cincinnati or Washington? I think that's the wrong focus. The president did not have to tell people to go out and target folks like us, right? He didn't have to say that. Nobody in the president's cabinet had to go out and tell the IRS to target people like us, because that feeling exists out there in the federal bureaucracy already, right? That they have to be worried about people like us. All the president had to do is precisely what he did, which is to joke about the idea of auditing your enemies, right? To make light of it. They say, oh, people who oppose me, yeah, they might want to worry about the IRS. All the president had to do is stand at that podium at the State of the Union address and chastise the Supreme Court for the Citizens United decision, which is a free speech decision, and to essentially say, I want to make sure that those who are on the other side, who are opposed to big government, that their freedom of speech, their political speech is shut down. And that sends a message down through the ranks that this will be supported by this administration. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. All right, so that message is out there. And then there are more direct and less nuanced ways that it gets done. So we know that the woman who oversaw the exempt organizations division at the IRS got $107,000 in bonuses during a 3-year period from 2009 to 2012 when this activity took place, right? She was targeting conservative groups, she was responsible for that division, and she received $107,000 in bonuses. So in other words, they thought she was doing a pretty good job, right? Right? 2 out of the 3 supervisorial employees that we know of during that time period, only that we know of right now, received promotions during that time period, right? One of them moved over to head the Obamacare implementation team, right? So in other words, nobody had to say to them, hey, do me a favor, keep targeting those conservative groups, we love it, because they were rewarded for it. And everybody that knew them, everybody that worked in those divisions could see, everybody knew this was going on, they could see this kind of behavior is rewarded in this government. Right? So you can create a culture and you can create a reward system that causes a certain behavior without ever saying we want to cause this behavior. So I think it's important that we don't focus so much on where did the behavior originate, who said it, who told. I doubt the president said anything specific to his staff, go use the IRS to target, but the culture had been created. And it's more important that we understand the culture was created because that's what we're fighting. In this fight, we're not fighting against the president. The president is only a symbol of the power that's been taken away from us and abused. What we're fighting against, literally, is the federal government, the beast, the Leviathan. This is what we're fighting against. This is our real fight in this country. The real fight isn't about a person. It's not about a particular election. It's not about a congressman. As much as I like to vilify her, it's not about Nancy Pelosi. Wouldn't it be great when she's gone? Like, I dream about that day. And to focus our anger on people like that, to focus our frustration on the president or particular people, but that takes our eye off the ball, because the ball is the beast. The ball is the dragon, this gigantic federal government and what it's taken from us. And what it has taken is our liberty. No doubt about it. You know that yellow-legged frog? I love, friend, that you did that. It was very cute, but the reality is that's very dangerous. What's going on here is they're taking away more and more and more of our rights. And in Nevada County, they've destroyed our industry already, right? They destroyed the logging industry. They destroyed the mining industry. They've destroyed ranching in California mostly, right? So they've gone after the industries upon which the state grew. They've destroyed those industries. The same is true all across the rest of the country, and this is what they do. And make no doubt, there's no doubt about it, this is not about environmentalism. All right? This is about control. Environmentalism is a control mechanism of the left. All right? So I get in trouble when I say this. People love to quote me in the media, so I like to say it, which is, green is the new red. All right, this is the way it works. This is how communists work. This is how communism works in this country. They assert control through a variety of mechanisms, and one is the environmental movement. There's a great book about the founding of Greenpeace. Patrick Moore is one of the founders of Greenpeace, and he's left Greenpeace now. And I've had the chance to meet him and get to know him a little bit. It's really interesting. He left Greenpeace because Greenpeace was originally founded as a pure environmental organization, and initially their goal was to fight whaling. You guys remember this? And so they were going after the Russian whaling ships, was their primary target initially. And I know a guy that knows Patrick really well, and I just met him in Sacramento, and he was telling me about one night he was out drinking with Patrick, and he asked him, he said, when I get up in the morning, I have trouble finding my keys at my house. How did you guys find Russian whaling ships in the middle of the ocean? Patrick said, oh, it's really easy. Every morning on the radio, we got a call from the CIA, and they told us exactly where the whaling ships were. He said, whoa, hold on. you guys are a bunch of crazy environmentalist hippies. You were working with the CIA? And they said, absolutely. The CIA was using Greenpeace to mess with the Russians, right? Global politics. There's always more going on than we know. And that's not to criticize Greenpeace, because what they wanted to do was stop Russian whaling. Right? So they had somebody who had satellites who could show them exactly where the Russian whales were. And every morning they got up and told them where those ships were so they could go harass them. So one of the reasons more, if you read his book, left Greenpeace is because they got taken over by the KGB. Right? So there's just this international fight going on where people use environmentalists as tools. And so then the KGB directs it against the U.S. Asked recently who he thought was controlling Greenpeace today, Moore said he thinks it's Chinese state security. So always remember there's more to this than meets the eye. Anybody hear of the recent environmentalist movie, anti-fracking movie called, what's it called? No, not Frack Nation, there's still anti-fracking.
Could you let people know that your computer's going around the room?
Sure. Well, I'm passing an iPad around. If you guys want to stay up to date with what Citizens for Self-Governance is doing, you can sign up on that iPad. It automatically puts you into our database. And unlike the NSA, we're not sharing that with the government. Our database is not on a Google server. So there's always more going on than meets the eye. So I think it's called Homeland, about anti-fracking movie. It's funded by the Saudis. Right, that movie was funded by the Saudis. Now, why would the Saudis fund an anti-fracking movie in the United States? It's a little bit obvious, isn't it? Matt Damon was asked about it and refused to answer questions about that. So there's all this money that flows around to all these environmental groups, and they're using it to exert control, to destroy the U.S. economy, to hurt the fundamental foundation of the United States. That's why it's so important for us to fight for our property rights. You know, property rights were originally part of the original rights that the founders were focused on. We have you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And some of that comes out of older writings, goes all the way back to Bastiat in France and beyond. And Bastiat included also the right to property. Property is liberty. Property is actually the physical manifestation of your liberty, your freedom, plus your work. Because when you go to work, you put your time in. That's your choice, right? You're free to do that or not. You put your time in, you trade that time for money, and with that money, you buy your property. So whatever your property is, if it's your car, if it's your real estate, if it's your watch, whatever, you traded your time, your liberty, your freedom for that property. So when they take your property rights away, they literally are directly taking your liberty. Don't let the government try to fool you into believing that somehow property is separate from liberty. It's not. Your right to use your property as you see fit is fundamental to your liberty. So that liberty is under attack today. You guys are fighting to regain that liberty. And it's not just to preserve it, because we've lost far too much of it. It's to regain that liberty. So what can you do to regain that liberty? I guess this is the fundamental question of our time. I would say there are a few things you can do. The first thing is just your attitude and your outlook. You're free people. Right? You're not serfs. You're not slaves. It's not our job to ask the government for permission to do things. It's our job to control that government beast and tell it what to do. So the first thing is how we approach the government and how we approach the idea of legislation, how we approach the immigration debate, right? The immigration debate, I don't know, have you guys been following this? I assume you guys have. So they're not going to read the bill before they vote on it. It's really hard for me to contain myself when I see that. I'm waiting for a Republican to say one of the, I guess some people are calling them the gang of the filthy 15, to say, oh, you have to pass it before you can, what's in it. Unbelievable. We have an immigration problem in this country. We do, absolutely. And it'd be good to see a reasonable debate on it. It'd be good to see an actual open debate around facts. So the key is, though, for me, the single question, this is why I have this organization, Citizens for Self-Governance. The question is, who decides? This is the most important question facing the country. It's a jurisdictional question. It's a constitutional question. And it goes to the foundation of who we are as a nation. Right? So we have this debate about everything in this country, whether it's healthcare or immigration or taxation or education policy. And this debate takes place in Washington, D.C. mostly. right? Sometimes at our state capitol. And we presume that that's okay. Because that's the way we've been taught that it is, right? It's up to the congressmen or the senators or the state legislature. But it's not. It's not. That's not a given. We've ceded that power to those people. We don't ask the question who decides, and that's a fundamental mistake. When we're talking about Obamacare, we can talk about whether we think we should have single-payer nationalized health care. I assume most people are against that. And we can have the debate about that versus the free market or everything in between. That debate, it actually hides the appropriate question, which is who should decide that question? Who should decide about your health care? Should that decision be made between you and your insurance company? What kind of coverage do you want? Shouldn't that be made in a free market transaction between you and your insurer? When you walk into your doctor's office, who should decide what kind of treatment you're going to get or what kind of tests you're going to have for what ails you? Shouldn't that be between you and your doctor? But we're having a debate in Washington right now that says that's not part of the equation, right? You don't have an option to have that between you and your doctor or you and your health insurance company. Some people far away who we don't know are deciding all those questions without us. So we've got to ask the question first, who decides? In healthcare, I think the answer is we decide, here at home. Us, our doctors, a free market transaction between us and our insurance company. And who decides? It's the fundamental question. So I ask that question, honestly, when I see proposed legislation. I ask it before I even ask the fundamental question, is that constitutional? It's more important to me to know, is that a decision I even want to talk about the federal government having the right to make? Who decides what Nevada County schools should teach our children? The Department of Education? The State Department of Education? Right? No, we should decide. As parents, as leaders in our own community, we should be making those decisions. Local school boards should be empowered to be making those decisions, right? So we shouldn't allow them to frame the argument that they make those decisions. We have only peripheral input from special interest groups on the outside, right? Those are our decisions to be made in our communities. Who should decide whether we set aside private habitat or even public lands in California for this yellow-legged frog? Some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.? But they shouldn't even have the choice to make that decision. Maybe we as a state, I would argue we as a county, I would argue on private land, you as the private landowner. It's fine if they want to educate you and say, hey friend, we think you have this yellow-legged frog on your property and we would like you to preserve it, and here's the reason you should, and here's how you do it, and then you can make that decision, right? That's a who decides question. So I'm asking you to always keep that framework in your mind. That is the framework of the founders. Right? We had this fight back in the beginning of the nation, and the fight was not about what is the decision, right? About was the fight about the appropriate level of taxation? Were they arguing about whether it's 2% on the T or 5% on the T? That wasn't the fight. The fight was about who decides. I think we forget sometimes that we were a nation of free men and women back then. Right? We were not a nation of subjects fighting for freedom. We've been self-governing for over 150 years, and what we were fighting about was the British had said, we will decide. The Crown had said, and Parliament had said, we will decide what you can do. And we had said, no, you won't. See, it was a simple fight over who decides. So fundamentally, our attitude, our demeanor, our posture, the way we approach our government should be, must be, has to be, if we're going to preserve the republic, we decide. It's up to us. It's our right. It's our heritage. It's our obligation. How do we decide? How do we take that power back to ourselves? The only way we can do it is by doing what the founders always said we had to do, which is by being engaged citizens. Coming to meetings like this is important. Being educated, connecting with other people who believe the way you do, learning, getting updates on things like the yellow-legged frog, or an immigration debate or whatever. Being educated and informed is really important. That's why we come here and network like this. But it's not enough. The founders expected that we would all take responsibility for our government, that we would all be engaged citizens. It is called self-governance for a reason, because we were expected to be involved and engaged citizens. And part of the reason the dragon has broken from its cage is because we haven't been involved enough. Because, people say to us, you should run for office. And we say, well, but I've got kids and grandkids, and I travel a lot, I'm really busy, my health isn't great, I'm having trouble paying my bills. Everything that happens to all of us. And that's what we say, and we say, you know, but somebody else needs to do that. Somebody else will do that, and I'll support them, right? We hear that over and over. We have that internal dialogue. Oh, I couldn't do that. I mean, I'm not good at speaking in public, or I don't know enough about these issues, or I'm too busy. Whatever it is, we have that internal dialogue with ourselves, and all of us do that, right? One more project can really take on one more project. The reality is we have to take on one more project. We all have to be engaged. We all have to be involved. Our numbers are phenomenal. Just in the Tea Party movement, just people who self-identify as Tea Partiers, our numbers are phenomenal. There's a reason that they targeted us, right? It's because they knew what was happening. They saw what happened in 2010, and they had to figure out how to slow you down. And they did, honestly. I don't know what the effect was, but they slowed down the Tea Party movement with what they did, for sure. But they haven't stopped us. And one thing they can't stop you from doing, they cannot stop you from being engaged civically. They can't stop you from running for office. They can't stop you from serving on the park commission or the school board. They cannot stop you. They wish they could. They would if they could find a mechanism for doing it, but they can't. And if you do, you can change the history of the world. I know that sounds radical, but if you don't change your school board, you can't change the world. If you don't stop your parks department from wasting money, that is your tax money and your neighbor's tax money, you can't change the world. Together, if we take over the parks department and the city council and the county board and the board of education and the board of supervisors and on up through the system, if we do that, we literally change the course of the world. We are that beacon in the world. We are still, the United States is still, thank God, the shining light of liberty in the world. But I'm telling you, that torch is flickering. And there are people around the world that desperately want to see that torch go out. There are people in this country that want to see this torch go out. They have a different vision for this country. They think that the country would be better off if smart people like them ran everything. If people like you who live out in the, the suburbs and the countryside were silenced and just had to go along like the cattle that they think you are. They want that torch of liberty to go out. They want to put out the spark. You can prevent that from happening by being engaged. So, Nancy talked about you running for office and serving on these boards and commissions. I would implore you, we have to do it. We have to do it. Everything we believe in, everything we hold dear, everything that God has granted us in this incredible country is at stake right now, more than ever before. You guys see it. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So when you go to bed tonight and you lay in bed and you think, what can I do to help? Or it's so frustrating, or, gosh, it was great what Mark had to say. It's so great, hearing whatever he's got to say about what's going on around the country. You need to turn inward and say, okay, now what can I do? So one of the things you can do in addition to running for office is you can volunteer here at the Tea Party. And this is equally important, right? The reason this organization runs is because people volunteer their time. This is the greatness of America. This is the way it's always been in this country. What I call intermediary institutions really run the country. Churches, in large part, and it used to be churches much more until they created this vast gulf of separation between church and state, which is not constitutional. Right? You guys know that. The separation of church and state is not constitutional, right? Just want to make sure we're all clear on that. Churches used to play a much bigger role in our society in making sure that the poor were fed, the hungry were fed, the poor were clothed, people had a place to live. Government took that role away from the churches, made it more and more difficult for churches to participate in that. Took more and more of your money, so you couldn't get your money in your church. So they took away intermediary institutions from us. They took away trade, any power of trade organizations. The old guilds used to have, again, more and more power away from the people to the government. So organizations like this are a way to empower ourselves. You guys can do that by being involved here. You saw Nancy. Nancy tried to retire from leadership. You guys have roped her back in. I think you're very lucky to have done that. But she needs help with that. She can't do that herself, right? And she's been putting in an incredible amount of time and energy over a long period of time in leading this organization. Eddie and Sue and my parents and a group of core group of people that have done it. There's always a core, whether it's a church or a social organization, there's always a core group of people. And the most important thing we can do to make these organizations thrive is to expand that core group. So I'm actually going to put you guys on the spot. We're going to take a 5-minute break right now. I'm going to ask you guys to go over to those tables and sign up for a committee. Get involved, be engaged. And everybody's like, oh God, he's putting us on the spot. I am putting you on the spot. So we're going to take a 5-minute break and then I'll come back and answer some questions for you guys. Thank you. Before you open it up for questions, I want to have somebody come up and ask me, are there really a lot of places that we can serve in local government? And I want you to know, as we move into 2014, 58 positions will be open in 2014. So over half of the room here, probably half of the room could actually serve on boards, commissions, elected positions in the county. So there's plenty of opportunity to serve. And it's really important that you understand what that means. It doesn't mean you have to take on a full-time job. Most of these positions, these committees, these boards, they meet once a month. And so you'd have the opportunity to go to a meeting once a month. I'm sure it would take several hours of preparation. But it just doesn't take that huge of a commitment out of your life. And it really is, it cannot overstate this. This is not a rhetoric. This is how we save the country. By taking control, people with our values, our beliefs, our commitment, taking control of their local communities. It's really the only way to save the country. We're not going to save the country at the federal level. I can promise you that. But I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. There are not a lot of people there who think we do. Right? And even if you were to send a couple hundred of them to Washington, D.C. that think the way we do, there are literally tens of thousands in Washington, D.C. who have the money and their fingers on the buttons and their hands on the levers of power that don't think the way we do. And so thinking that you're going to fix it by electing the right congressman or the right senator or even the right president, I just, for those of you who are old enough, I ask you to think back to Ronald Reagan, right? We didn't fix it during the Reagan era. To me, that proves that it can't be fixed in Washington, D.C. If Ronald Reagan and that Congress, with a Republican majority in both houses, Newt Gingrich in the House of Representatives, if they couldn't fix it in Washington, D.C., it can't be fixed from D.C. And I would argue it cannot be fixed from D.C. It can only be fixed from home. Right? The states created the federal government, didn't they? It seems like the federal government has forgotten that. It seems like the states have forgotten that. We can fix this from the states. We can. And we're starting to see some states do this. We're starting to see states push back against the federal government. We're starting to see guys like Rick Perry in Texas push back against the federal government. We're going to see a movement here developing, we're participating in, for a convention of the states to push back against the federal government, to get the leaders in the states together to start talking about what do we need to do to restrain the beast. And what they're going to say, and what they say when I talk to state legislatures is, man, what we really need is we need people in their cities and their counties and their parishes to take control. Because when they take control, they give the state legislature, the legislators that feel the way they do, more power. Right? Because then the cities and the counties come into the state with their hands out, and they rebalance the relationship between the local jurisdictions and the state jurisdictions. So we can do this at home, but you guys have to sign up for these positions. I also want to address, we've had a controversy here recently in this Tea Party, and I'm no stranger to controversy in the Tea Party. What happens locally happens at the national level and vice versa. I mean, we're just all human beings. It happens at every level. And so there was some stuff that flew around in the paper here that was really frustrating to see. There were allegations of fraud and misdealing here at the local level. And it was all around the idea that the local group didn't have their 501c4 status from the federal government and also their tax exempt status from the state government, but there were allegations of fraud and all this stuff. So I want you to know that that was all tied up in the delays from the federal government and then delays from the state government. I want you to know all that stuff's resolved. And the local organization worked their way through that under Nancy's leadership. So this organization now has its C4 status, now has its tax exempt status in the state. And so everything. And when you see people make allegations like that in the paper, what I always do is I just want to know, who are the allegations being made against? Do I know those people? Do I know their character? Do I know their heart? I think here locally we know the leadership's character and heart, right? Yeah. You guys are with me on that, so we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Another thing that the local group has done recently is they joined in as plaintiff in the class action lawsuit against the IRS. So, if you want to know more about that litigation, you can go to at suetheirs.com. Hard to believe you could get a domain like that. You know, when we thought about suing the IRS, I thought, oh, I gotta go find a domain. We want to put up a website for this. And literally, when I typed in sue the IRS, I didn't believe that I was actually going to be able to get that domain. It was just the very first name that came to mind. And when I saw it, I was really taken aback. Because I've searched for a lot of domains, bought a lot of domains over the last few years. And it's hard to find a good domain, right? And I looked at that and I thought, man, this is a perfect indicator of the fear level of the American public for the IRS. Like, who would be stupid enough to take sue the IRS? You know, my wife is so tolerant. She's helpful, I told you at the beginning of the meeting. She's also very tolerant because this whole Tea Party thing has turned our lives topsy-turvy. And it used to be when I would tell her something like, you know, hey, I just took the domain suetheirs.com, she would say, what? Are you crazy? This time she just laughed and smiled and shook her head. Yeah. She knew what was coming. So, did I cover everything you guys need me to cover? Are we good? Yes? Mom?
Yes.
How much?
I'd like to talk to you about your
See, you always got to ask Mom, right? You mean about Citizens for Self-Governance? Okay, so Citizens for Self-Governance is the organization I set up after leaving the Tea Party Patriots. And I want to make clear, I didn't leave the Tea Party movement. I think you guys can see that. I'm here. I speak at Tea Parties all over the country. This is where my political roots are, and it's where they will always be. I left Tea Party Patriots because I wanted to broaden the movement. I didn't like what that organization was doing and started getting involved in straight-up Republican politics. And it's sort of become a fundraising machine, and I'm just a grassroots guy. I don't like the parties in Washington, D.C. I don't need the fancy cars. I could drive my pickup truck, or I don't need to be on TV. I'm just a grassroots guy, and so I went out, based on my experience traveling around the country and meeting with people all over the country, and now I know what people need. I know what grassroots organizations need, and they need training, they need support, they need mentoring, and they need money. Right? I mean, it's rough running local organizations. And so Citizens for Self-Governance, you can find that organization at selfgovern.com on the web. And if you sign up on that iPad, that blue iPad that's going around, we'll get you tied into the loop there. We're here to support local grassroots organizations all across the country. One of the things we've done is we created the $1 million self-governance investment fund. So there's a fund literally of $1 million that's set aside. That money will start flowing out to groups, local groups like this, all across the country, who are engaged in self-governance initiatives. And what I mean by self-governance initiatives is we're not here to help people get people elected. We're not here to get out the vote necessarily. What we're here to do is anytime an organization has a project that's fighting to take governance local, to take it away from the state, or even to take it away from the county and just give it back to the people, to take it back to the federal government and bring it to the states, anything that is designed to shrink the power of government, we're going to put money out there into the communities helping local groups do that. Does that sound like a good idea to you guys? That's what I'm raising money for. We're also the funder for this litigation against the IRS. We sued the IRS because we saw that nobody else was doing it. You know, I follow the news, you guys are following the news about the IRS. What I saw is lots of people were going on the news and talking about how outraged they were, right? Lots of heads of organizations, they were writing op-eds, they were going on Hannity or whatever and talking about how outrageous it was what the IRS had done. And then they were following that with fundraising pleas. And nobody was doing anything. And I'm just kind of an action guy. Like, I want to get in the ring and start taking swings, right? And all these people are talk. That's what people do on TV. And I was just frustrated. And I started calling around to the groups I knew who I thought should be fighting, like the ACLJ, Jay Sekulow, who has now filed litigation, who I know, like Cleta Mitchell, who filed on behalf of True the Vote. Like, and I started asking those guys, are you guys going to file litigation? And they could not get a straight answer. It was really frustrating. I know the senior counsel at ACLJ, great, brilliant lawyer by the name of David French, and I sent him an email saying, I need to know, are you going to file litigation or are you guys just going to talk about this? And he said, well, his email back to me was very cryptic. It said, you know, we've made our demand at the IRS and we'll see what happens. Right? And these are the answers I was getting. And I thought, you know, these guys are making millions of dollars off of saying that they're fighting with the IRS. And ACLJ, by the way, was doing a great job of representing groups that hadn't got their status yet, still demanding their status. And so we decided that we were going to file. and that we were going to spend our money, you know, it costs a lot of money to sue the federal government. They have infinite resources. They don't worry about the legal bills. We have to. And so, but we wanted to take a different approach. I'm a former litigator. I'm a recovering attorney. And I know what it takes to prosecute a successful litigation. And we wanted to treat the IRS like the criminal thugs that they are. Though it involves the Constitution, I don't see this as some highbrow constitutional litigation. I see it as a criminal prosecution, right? These people were violating the Constitution, violating our rights, and so we found a lawyer, a guy that I've worked with in the past, and a bunch of conservative groups I know I've worked with, and he's a former U.S. attorney out of Kansas City. His name is Todd Graves, and he is one badass prosecutor. He spent his career tracking down federal criminals and putting them in jail. Right? And so this is the guy that I wanted to represent the people who had been harassed, targeted, profiled, and abused by the IRS. So we got Todd Graves on the case. We also got one of the best class action attorneys in the nation, who was actually a defense attorney in the tobacco class action cases. And we brought a class action which nobody else has done because they're complicated, right? So ACLJ, they don't generally bring class actions. Cleta Mitchell, one of the top nonprofit lawyers in the country, she doesn't generally work in class actions. But a class was really important because we know from the IRS's own admission there are at least a couple of hundred groups targeted, right? I think that number will go much higher once we know the full facts. Only a class action can represent all of those people. Right? ACLJ, they're signing up individual plaintiffs. That's great. I'm glad they're doing that. But there are going to be hundreds of others that never sign up that won't be represented. And our job is to go after the government, to get these groups compensated, and then to give that money out to all these groups that were injured. So that's why we filed a class action. There's something else interesting about a class action for you guys to pay attention to. So litigation is painfully slow, right? It's like molasses in winter to watch the litigation progress. And the government will do everything they can to slow that down. They will refuse every discovery request. They will file every motion they can to stall the thing. But a class action has this really unique feature, which is you have to file for certification of the class. So you file your complaint, and then usually in a class action, the plaintiff will wait until the defendant answers the complaint. They'll file a motion to dismiss, all kinds of stuff, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months will go on, before they file a motion to certify the class. But you don't have to wait. And so we're not waiting. I mean, I've instructed our attorneys, we want you to fight like your life depends on it, day in and day out. So we'll be shortly filing our motion to certify the class. That's important because it allows us to get into discovery. Right? For those of you who haven't been in litigation, discovery means we get to start asking the government all the tough questions, right? Normally it would be well into next year before we get into discovery. But because we're going to certify the class, the fundamental question in a class action certification motion is, who's in the class? Right? So we get to ask the question, who did you target? Give us a list of every group targeted by the IRS. Now that puts the IRS in a very unique situation, and a very difficult situation, which I just love. So think about this now. If you're the lawyers defending the IRS, you have a conundrum. Do you just say, you know what, we're not going to fight class certification, so we don't want to give you that? Or do you say, here's the list? Either way, it's good for us, right? We either certify the class, which is really powerful, or we just get the list up front. And frankly, they're going to have to give us the list either way. It's the fundamental issue in class certification. So that's the battle that you're going to see, and you'll see it documented at suetheirs.com. You're going to see that battle over the next probably 90 to 120 days. So stay tuned. Keep going to that website and checking back. We're going to have a lot of fun abusing these government employees. Yeah, there are a lot of religious liberty organizations have joined the class, like Faith and Freedom Coalition of Ohio. You might have seen Ken Blackwell on Hannity or other shows. There's a very prominent black conservative, been part of the RNC, so he runs the Ohio chapter of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. They've joined us. There's some pro-Israel groups that have joined us, and until these plaintiffs choose to name themselves publicly, I can't give out the names. And this is one of the interesting things. People are joining the suit and they're scared to be known publicly. So they're still scared of what the IRS will do to them. or they're scared that their donors will know that they joined the litigation and won't want to be donors anymore. So the class also allows us to protect those people from that. Those who are willing to stand and say, we'll stand and we'll be the front lines, we'll be the Marines on the beach. People can come in behind us and they don't have to be identified. So that's the status of the litigation. I want to open it up for questions at this point so people can feel free to ask questions. So raise your hand. Eddie has a microphone there.
Mark, if I may make one
Yep.
comment here, because of the number of people we have and Mark's time, would you please just address them with questions, not speeches tonight? Because otherwise we'll be here and they'll cut the lights out on us, okay? So when you address them, please come up with a question right away. Thank you.
What was the website again, Mark?
Selfgovern.com. Yes, ma'am.
Mark's good to see you as always.
Thank
Just
you.
wondered, what are they using for, we could say that the IRS is doing these things, but what did they use as the static level saying, this proves that they were abusing their power? What is that defining thing?
It's really interesting because I'm having litigated a bunch of cases over the years. You go into a case, and the first thing you have to do is prove that the defendant did what you're saying that they did. They already admitted that they did.
Yeah.
They already said that they targeted, and that in and of itself is totally unconstitutional. In other words, it's called, under First Amendment, it's called viewpoint discrimination. So they applied a different set of criteria to people who express a particular political viewpoint, and that in and of itself is unconstitutional. To me, it's stunning that we're engaged in a litigation where the defendant has already admitted the threshold wrongdoing. So that's really the threshold, and that part of the case is done. Yes, sir.
Mark, what about the new guy that's in charge of IRS? He has alleged that progressives were also targeted.
Yes.
Now, I haven't seen the list of the progressives targeted. So, I wanted you to weigh in on that.
So that's the new guy is Commissioner Werfel, I think is his name, and he has alleged that the targeting was broader. This, in my opinion, is just misinformation he put out to create a smokescreen and to give the media, the left media, talking points. The left media has been relatively cooperative with us on the scandal, haven't they? I mean, I wouldn't say they're enthusiastic Tea Party supporters, but really, because so many Americans, 95% of Americans hate the IRS, the leftist media hasn't been able to just dismiss the scandal. It would just look too bad for them, they just can't do it. And so I think Werfel is floating talking points to allow the leftist media to glance it. You're right, no groups have been identified. And frankly, if they are, we're happy to have them as part of our litigation. So, and I put that out there, and I have a lot of contacts on the left. So from before the time we filed, I've been putting out to my contacts, if you know any groups on the left that have been discriminated against based on their viewpoint, then please contact me, and we will pay for their representation.
No takers yet.
There we go. No takers yet. I'm not holding my breath.
Could you comment a little bit on the Supreme Court's decision against Arizona?
Sure. So we had the Supreme Court Arizona on their Arizona decision on the Arizona law, and I don't think that decision was as bad as people made it out to be. So the Supreme Court basically said that the federal voting is controlled by the federal government, and that is the way it's supposed to be. And they made a distinction, federal immigration law is controlled. I'm on the Voting Rights Act case today, I'll talk about that. That federal immigration law is controlled by the federal government and that they can't make conflicting law. And so basically what they did is any place where it conflicted, they overruled SB 1070. But where it didn't conflict, they didn't overrule it. The ruling was not as broad as indicated in the leftist media. That was a place where the leftist cheerleaders took a news story and made it into something that it wasn't. And so I think that's really important. You're going to see that on the voting rights case that came out today. So that decision didn't really bother me. It was decided on very narrow grounds, and I think it was actually, it was a 80-20 victory for conservatives. Anybody want, should we talk voting rights? Yeah. So the voting rights case that came down today, I think this is probably one of the most important cases we're going to see out of the Supreme Court in this term, and it went our way. Right? So what people wanted to see is they wanted to see the entire Voting Rights Act overturned, and those that are frustrated by this decision on the right are frustrated because the court didn't just point blank overturn the Voting Rights Act. What the court did is said that the provisions of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act were no longer appropriate. They were unconstitutional. Section 4 talked about the states and the criteria for states that had to have pre-approval for changing any laws around voting. Literally, if they're going to move a voting precinct, a voting place 20 feet, they had to get permission from the Department of Justice. And this has been a tool for the Department of Justice to use politics to prevent any rational changes to voting rights. It was based on a situation that existed, 50 years ago in this country. And the Supreme Court said that's not rational, it doesn't pass constitutional muster. So now they have to come up with new standards for states upon whom these restrictions, the pre-qualification restrictions, should be imposed. And my reading of the case, and I had a chance to read the decision today, makes it sound like it is going to be very difficult for them to come up with any reasonable reasons for these pre-qualification restrictions. It effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, which for where we're at in our country's history today, that's a good thing. So I think it was a great decision today.
Will that affect voter ID?
It does affect voter ID. There are 11 states that have now enacted voter ID laws. I was just reading a white paper on that before I came over here. There are 5 states where those have been stopped by the Department of Justice. Those voter ID schemes will all now move forward as implemented. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a very broad sweeping move for voter ID laws all across the country. Now, Eric Holder had a press conference today where he's outraged and basically said that the president, and this is really scary stuff, with the president and what the head of the Department of Justice said basically is they're going to figure out how to get around the Supreme Court. And so that's a fundamental problem in the country, and it's not just a Democratic problem. We've got a problem where the executive is trying to figure out how to do things that are unconstitutional because they want to. And so we need to restrain the executive. But that's what we're going to have to be watching for, is what is the executive branch going to do in light of this decision. You know, this is, by the way, this ties back to the IRS situation. The reason I believe that we have the IRS situation, and I think Discovery will show this, and some journalist is going to come upon this, is based on the Citizens United decision. Right? They didn't like that decision. And it was a free political speech decision. That's really what Citizens United did, is it said that you can't stop people from spending money to do political speech, essentially, from grouping together to do political speech. The president didn't like that. His administration didn't like it. And so they started using the IRS to crack down on people who were exercising their rights to political speech. And so we're going to see, I believe, the same kind of thing. They don't like this decision from the Supreme Court. They're going to start to use the power of the executive, or abuse the power of the executive, to go around the Supreme Court. It's a parallel situation. Over here. Yes, ma'am.
When you speak of the voter rights, and you spoke of it broadly across the land, how does it particularly affect California and maybe some of our local elections? Is there anything we can do or what should we do?
So, did you guys hear the question? No. The question was specifically, how does this affect California and counties in California? How does it affect our rights here, and what can we do? And I think, largely it doesn't affect California that much. We're not one of the states that's subject to stricter scrutiny under the Voting Rights Act, under Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and so I don't think we're going to see much difference here in California. It does give us the freedom, if we ever could get this done in a rational legislature. I realize now I'm talking fantasy, but if we could put voter ID in place and reasonable restrictions like that. But I don't expect we're going to see much difference in California from this decision. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Mark, I was wondering, when this law case goes forward, is this a situation where you have to go judge shopping, like they do in many cases now, looking for a judge they feel is going to be favorable to a particular point of view, or is it equally satisfying?
You on our IRS case? So the question is about judge shopping for the IRS case, and generally speaking, it's interesting. We had this discussion before we filed the lawsuit. People go out, especially in federal jurisdiction, and they search for a jurisdiction where they believe they can get a judge that's favorable to them. And I can tell you, though it's done all the time, the federal courts do not look kindly upon this. And so we chose to file in Cincinnati in the 6th District for 2 reasons. One is we were essentially judge shopping, which is we felt like we would get a more fair hearing in the heartland, right, in Ohio, than we were going to get in a Washington, D.C. federal court. This seems logical to us, right? It also made sense for the case because the majority of the witnesses, though this may go up to Washington, D.C., the majority of the on-the-ground witnesses, discovery and the like, are all going to be in the Cincinnati area. So we felt like we were going to get a better judge there. That's why I think it's interesting that the other cases that have been filed, the ACLJ and the Cleta-Mitchell-True both cases were both filed in Washington, D.C. I think that was done in large part because Cleta and the J. Secular are both based in Washington, D.C. That's where they have their offices, their staffs are there. So litigation in the Washington, D.C. District Court is much more practical for them. I just don't think it's good for us. And I also think that the fight that's being had here in this IRS case is a fight of the citizens versus the federal government. It's not the insider club in D.C. versus the insider club in D.C., right? And so I think the optics of it, for it all to take place in D.C., it goes against what I think about who decides. Who should decide? Ohio, the people of this country, the heartland, about this case, or folks in Washington, D.C.? And I think it's Ohio. Over here.
Mark, you said you visit New York still. Do you have visitation rights to your gun? Is that situation over?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, and it sounds like most of you do, I had the privilege of spending time in the New York correctional system a year ago, December, on a gun violation, what they claimed was a gun violation, unconstitutional arrest for having a firearm with me in a locked case transiting through the airport. And they confiscated my weapon. The case is over, by the way. It was all criminal charges were dismissed. I actually had to plead guilty to a misdemeanor disorderly conduct. In New York, disorderly conduct means exercising your Second Amendment rights. But that's what they require. It's really, for me, that experience, it was a horrible experience. I can make light of it now. It was really a horrendous experience to get arrested and be handcuffed and stuffed in a squad car and taken to jail. I was processed through Queens Central Booking in New York City. Whatever you think of when I say Queens Central Booking, it's twice as bad. And so to be in there all day to call my wife and tell her that I was in jail, it's just a horrendous experience. And I think it happened to me for a reason. You wonder, you look at these things in hindsight, you wonder why does something like that happen? And I travel around the country, and what I'm trying to do, what I believe I'm doing, what I wake up every morning to do is to fight for liberty. It's really that simple. It's liberty or tyranny. That's the choice, right? And so I get up in the morning. It's a great privilege that God has given me to go to my desk and to engage in that fight every day and to have that be my living. And so there's this concept that we all talk about, liberty versus tyranny, and we talk about what tyranny is and how we're living under tyranny. And it's an intellectual exercise when we have that discussion with ourselves, or we sit around in a group like this and we talk about liberty versus tyranny. For most of us, it's intellectual. When you get arrested, when they cuff you up in violation of your Second Amendment, when they put you in jail, and when they charge you with a crime, by the way, they charged me with carrying a loaded firearm, which was unloaded and locked, and I wasn't carrying it, with the intent to do harm. Right? And so we asked them, what evidence do you have? They won't even answer that. Right? So when you go through an experience like that, you've actually experienced tyranny. You've actually lived tyranny. And you actually realize, I realized for me, how fine the line is between liberty and tyranny. So you can be living your life as a law-abiding citizen, trying to do everything that you believe is right and correct and abiding by the laws of the land, and you can find yourself in jail. Right? And that is tyranny. So for me, I think the reason I went through that experience was to teach me in real, visceral terms what it's like to have your liberty taken from you. And that's the country that we live in today, right? Where people violate our constitutional rights, people take away people's property. And I sat in that jail cell, and I want you to know some of the worst creeps in society in that jail cell with me, right? And in that moment, I started hearing stories of guys that, I look at these guys and I'm judging them by how they look. I admit, tattoos on their faces and You know, the guys are serious gangbangers, and there are guys in there that are saying, I've been in here 4 days and I haven't seen a judge. All right, now I may look at the guy and I may judge him and I may say he looks like a sleazy gangbanger, but it shouldn't happen in America where a guy's in jail 4 days without seeing a judge. And that's what I saw when I was in that jail. I saw that kind of tyranny. And that helped me to engage in the fight for criminal justice reform in the country too. So my gun situation, which is now resolved, led me to just be more convicted in my fight against tyranny.
But you didn't get your gun back.
I did not get my gun back, and I don't have visitation rights. They terminated custody permanently.
Hi, Mark. I have a question about the IRS and their going after conservative groups. What, if any, proof is there if the citizens who are supporting these groups, does the IRS target them?
You know, we don't have direct proof yet, but I think there is anecdotal evidence that some citizens who support these groups have been targeted. Certainly, we do have absolutely direct evidence that citizens who are engaged in the leadership of these groups have been personally targeted. Or you have people who've been audited. You know, the quintessential case is Catherine Engelbrecht, who runs Through the Vote, who has had Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms inspections. You've got guys like Frank, who runs Melaleuca, who is a big donor to Romney, who has had Labor Department audits and EPA audits and other stuff. Frank Vanderstoel. And so we know for sure that there's a class of people who are being targeted personally. I think what we're going to find through the discovery process, we're going to be able to link those. They're somewhere in the millions of pages of documentation that they'll turn over to various. We're going to find smoking gun emails and documentation. We're also going to find it because we have an investigatory team headed by a former criminal division investigator from the IRS that we hired. Guy ran 11 states criminal investigation for the IRS. He's my lead investigator. So we hired an investigator. Unlike the other litigants who will do this through the discovery process, we have shoes on the ground in Cincinnati and around the country who will be investigating. They're literally going to employees' doors and knocking on the doors and saying, hey, we know you didn't intend this. What can you tell us about what went on? You know, we'll give you cover. We'll get the information out there. You can be a whistleblower. So we're going to find it. It's there. We'll find the direct proof.
Hi, Mark. My question is regarding immigration reform. What is your take on Marco Rubio's position?
I'm very sad by Marco Rubio. You know, I wish I could say I didn't see it coming. I saw it coming not because I'm so smart, but because Florida Tea Partiers have been warning me about Marco Rubio since the beginning. And which is really interesting because, you know, you see him on TV, you listen to the guy talk, you follow his positions, it all sounds really great. He's been a really great, articulate spokesperson for conservative ideas. What I was told by the Florida Tea Partiers every time I've been traveling there for the last few years is, we don't trust him. And I kept saying, why? Well, we just don't trust him. I don't know. We just think that there's more than meets the eye. And the biggest thing was, he's never spoken at a Tea Party. Not one Tea Party. His staff doesn't return Tea Party calls. He's never when he was running, when he go to a Tea Party candidates forum, he just distanced himself from the Tea Party from the very beginning. And that made them nervous, and they felt like, you know, he wasn't going to stand on principle when the time came. And so I've been traveling around the country telling people this for years. I didn't have a personal judgment, but I would just say this is what I hear on the ground in Florida. And so the positions that he's taking and his, what I consider his softness and his squishiness on this immigration issue, I think is consistent with what I've heard from the Florida Tea Party. And I think what he's doing is he wants to be president. And I think he's tacking to the middle, doing what he believes he needs to do to position himself for a presidential run. I'm very unhappy. Bless you.
Thank you, Mark. I just recently read some material on Mark Rubio. he speaks a different language, literally, when he's talking to Hispanics. He's talking a very liberal, almost hearty Democratic line in Spanish. You won't hear him say it in English.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, and it's really interesting because statistically, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but you can find it online. If you look at the statistical analysis on the Hispanic vote, if Mitt Romney had gotten 70% of the Hispanic vote, he would not have won the election. Right, so it's just, and you're not going to get the Hispanic vote by going soft on immigration. Right, so it's a twofold failing strategy. You won't get the vote anyway, and even if you got 70% of it, which you're not going to get, it wouldn't make the electoral difference. Rick, you have a follow-up question?
Just, regarding the IRS, if there turns out to be another department within the organization, like Gibson Guitars, where they help get all their revenue, that wasn't the IRS, that was, get authority.
I don't know if it was Congress.
ICE.
Yeah,
Customs.
can they then also be reeled in under the same thing?
Did you guys, you want me to repeat that?
Yes.
This is a very important point. I'm glad you brought it up. So the question really was about interdepartmental cooperation. Is this really about the IRS, or is this about the broader federal government? And the reality is, again, the IRS is a symptom of a sickness. It's a cancer eating the entire federal government. It's been cast aside. The federal government itself today is the cancer, right, on the people of the country. So the question was, what happens if we find that there are other departments involved? And I would say there are other departments involved. I mean, we're certain of this. One of the things that my lead investigator told me up front when we said, and by the way, interesting fact, he lives in the Bay Area. I had my first meeting with him at Paulette's. Everywhere in the country he could be, he came up here and he knew Grass Valley really well. So one of the first things he said is, just so you know, this is not just an IRS. He said, I know how we work in the IRS. The IRS cooperates with other agencies of the federal government. We believe we're going to find direct evidence of interdepartmental cooperation in this targeting and harassment. And when we do, we will amend our complaint and we will add those other agencies. And we're going to take them all down. By the way, just so you know, I always like to have a big goal. If you want huge goals, my parents taught me, shoot for the stars, end up on the moon. It's a pretty good view from there. So the goal is abolition of the IRS. People will tell you, that's crazy. Well, how will the federal government collect taxes? Well, so we'll just get rid of the 16th Amendment. We won't have a federal income tax. That wouldn't be so bad. But even prior to that, you could get rid of the IRS if you went to a simple flat tax. Every state has a tax collection mechanism, and they could collect that tax on behalf of the federal government and just pass it through. The government doesn't like that because it's less opportunity for graft and harassment and all the good stuff they love to do, but that's the goal. The goal is the abolition of the IRS.
I'm just wondering, which website, or will there be a website that we can follow the progress as this IRS?
That lawsuit is suetheirs.com. So there are updates there every couple of days on what's going on in that litigation.
Great, thank you.
Mark, I've been asked to ask you by a shy Tea Partier, seems a contradiction in terms, but that's the case. What is your take on the influence of Agenda 21 on losing our property rights?
So Agenda 20, and I'm sure there are people who don't know what Agenda 21 is. It's nothing like Area 51. Agenda 21 is something that came out of the UN, which was about property rights and control of property rights at an international level. It's really about, a lot of it is about water rights and control of water. And, fundamentally, if you think about it, if you control the water, you control everything. Right? Where there's no water, there's no people. Right? And so if you control how the water flows, then you have the ultimate power. It seems so simple and agrarian in a modern society, but it really is that simple. And the UN, through Agenda 21, is seeking to assert control over worldwide water. In order to do that, they assert control over personal property rights. And when you hear terms like sustainable development and smart growth, those come out of the UN's Agenda 21. They sound good. Of course we want sustainable development, and of course we want smart growth. The question is, who defines what sustainable development is? And who defines what is smart growth? And I can tell you under Agenda 21 and its auspices, you don't decide those things, right? We go back to the fundamental who decides question. That ultimately comes from the UN, through the federal government, through the state government, through your local governments. And a lot of local governments have bought into this without even realizing what they're buying into. I mean, you got good people who say, wow, you'll give us a grant to make sure that we're doing smart growth and sustainable development, and it sounds really good. And so I think it's imperative that you pay attention to smart growth, to sustainable development policies coming out of city councils, county boards, and state government, because it's a bad thing. It is literally a way, an underhanded way to take away our rights.
Mark, we cannot thank you enough.